750,000 acres across northern Arizona, 15,000 head of cattle, a family name on Arizona governors, cabinet secretaries, and Supreme Court shortlists, 138 years of continuous operation, still privately held by descendants of 5 brothers who arrived in Flagstaff in 1886 with nothing. Legendary. Yes. But the legend doesn't tell you this. The brothers couldn't agree on anything. Their children couldn't agree. Their grandchildren sued each other. The ranch has been offered for sale at least 6 times. The offers totaled over $100 million. Every offer was rejected. Not because the family didn't want to sell, because half the family wanted to sell and half wanted to keep it, and the governance structure they created requires everyone to agree. Babbitt Ranches is not a monument to family unity. It is a monument to family paralysis, a business that survived not because of vision, but because dysfunction prevented anyone from making big decisions. An empire that expanded because the federal government gave them grass for almost nothing, then nearly collapsed when the federal government took it back. A dynasty that produced a Secretary of the Interior who regulated his own family's grazing permits and created a conflict of interest so obvious it became a national scandal. Is this a story of perseverance? Or a cautionary tale about what happens when you build a business on land you don't own and a family structure that guarantees deadlock? If you enjoy deep dives into family empires that shaped the American West and the dysfunction that kept them frozen for generations, please like and subscribe. And tell me in the comments which ranch or family business I should investigate next. Your support makes these documentaries possible. Chapter 1. 5 Brothers and a Trading Post. They came from Cincinnati to sell groceries. David, George, Charles, Edward, and William Babbitt. Sons of a successful Ohio merchant family. Not desperate, not fleeing, just restless. The kind of restlessness that comes from knowing you'll inherit a comfortable life if you stay, and wondering if you could build something bigger if you leave. In 1886, David Babbitt, the oldest, arrived in Flagstaff, Arizona Territory. The town was 4 years old. The Atlantic and Pacific Railroad had reached Flagstaff in 1882, turning what had been a cattle camp into a railroad stop. The population was maybe a few hundred people. The economy was timber, livestock, and supplying the railroad crews. David opened a general store. Groceries, dry goods, hardware. The kind of business the Babbitt family knew how to run. Within a year, his brothers joined him. George in 1887, Charles in 1888, Edward and William shortly after. 5 brothers, 1 store, a town barely large enough to support it. The store did fine. Flagstaff was growing. The railroad brought settlers. The timber companies brought workers. The nearby Mormon settlements brought farmers, but groceries were not going to make them rich. Profit margins were thin. Competition was increasing. The Babbitts were good merchants, not exceptional ones. Then they noticed something. The ranchers who came into town to buy supplies were doing better than the storekeepers. Cattle prices were rising. The railroads made it possible to ship beef east. The federal government had opened vast stretches of Arizona territory to grazing, and most importantly, the land was free. Not free to own, free to use. The federal government owned millions of acres across northern Arizona, grasslands that stretched from Flagstaff to the Utah border, land that no one had homesteaded because it was too dry for farming. But cattle could survive on that land, if you had enough of it, and the government was issuing grazing permits for almost nothing. The Babbitts saw the opportunity. In 1891, they bought their first cattle, a few hundred head. They applied for grazing permits on federal land south of Flagstaff. The permits cost pennies per acre. The grass was free. The water came from springs and seasonal creeks. The investment was minimal. The potential was enormous. By 1893, they had acquired more permits and more cattle. They branded their stock CO Bar, a mark that would become synonymous with northern Arizona ranching. They hired cowboys. They built line camps. They were no longer storekeepers who owned cattle. They were cattlemen who owned a store. But the brothers had a problem. They were 5 equal partners. Every decision required consensus. David wanted to expand aggressively. George was more conservative. Charles focused on the store. Edward handled finances. William managed day-to-day ranch operations. When they agreed, things moved quickly. When they disagreed, nothing happened. This would be the pattern for the next 130 years. Agreement meant action. Disagreement meant paralysis. And as the family grew, as 5 brothers became 37 children, and then dozens of grandchildren, and then more than 50 great-grandchildren, the potential for disagreement multiplied exponentially. But in the 1890s, the brothers were young and aligned. They wanted to build an empire, and the federal government was going to help them do it. Chapter 2. The grass the government gave away. The federal government owned the grass, the Babbitts owned the cattle. That distinction mattered more than anyone understood at the time. In the American West in the late 1800s, land ownership was complicated. Homesteaders could claim 160 acres under the Homestead Act. Miners could claim mineral rights. Timber companies could purchase forest land. But the vast arid rangelands that covered millions of acres across Arizona, Nevada, Utah, Wyoming, and Montana were owned by the federal government and managed by no one. The government's policy was simple. If you wanted to graze cattle on federal land, you applied for a permit. The fee was nominal, a few cents per animal per month. The permit granted you the right to graze a specific number of cattle on a specific area. It was not ownership. It was a license that could theoretically be revoked. But in practice, the permits were never revoked. Once a rancher secured a permit, it was treated as a property right. Permits were bought and sold. They were passed down through families. They were used as collateral for loans. The federal government collected the fees, but did not manage the land. Overgrazing was common. Erosion was rampant. But no one stopped it. For the Babbitts, this system was perfect. They could control hundreds of thousands of acres without buying the land. The capital requirement was minimal. Buy cattle, get permits, hire cowboys. The grass was free. The water was free. The land cost almost nothing. By 1900, the Babbitt brothers controlled permits for 250,000 acres of federal grazing land. By 1910, it was 400,000. By 1920, it was approaching 700,000. The CO Bar Ranch had become one of the largest cattle operations in Arizona, and they had done it by leasing, not buying. 1893 almost ended it. The drought came in spring and did not break until the following winter, 17 months without significant rain. The grass stopped growing in May. By July, it was gone. By August, the cattle were eating bark off trees. The Babbitts had 15,000 head of cattle scattered across 250,000 acres of federal permits. The permits were worthless without grass. You cannot graze cattle on dirt. The brothers faced the same choice every Arizona rancher faced that year: sell the herd at panic prices or watch them die. Cattle prices collapsed. Every rancher was selling at once. Cows that had been worth $25 per head dropped to $8, then $5. Then buyers stopped coming. There was no market, just desperate sellers and no one to buy. David Babbitt, the oldest brother, made a decision. They would not sell. They would drive the herd north into Utah territory, into high country where snowmelt might keep the grass alive. It was a gamble. The drive would take weeks. Cattle were already weak. Some would die on the trail, but all would die if they stayed. They hired every available cowboy in Flagstaff, 20 men and 30 horses. They gathered the herd and pushed north. The drive was chaos. Weak cattle fell behind, predators followed. Cowboys worked 18-hour days trying to keep the herd moving. At night, they could hear cattle dying in the darkness, bawling, then silence. They lost 3,000 head on that drive, 20% of the herd dead before they reached Utah. The financial loss was staggering, but 10,000 cattle survived. When the drought finally broke in 1894, the Babbitts drove the survivors back to Arizona. They still had a herd. Most of their neighbors did not. The drought taught the brothers something. Size was not enough. They needed flexibility, permits across different elevations and climate zones. If one area dried out, they moved cattle to another. They began acquiring permits in northern Arizona mountains, in high desert valleys, in areas that got winter snow and summer monsoons. Diversification across geography would save them again in the 1930s and again in the 2000s, but it also taught them something darker. Survival required ruthlessness. The cowboys who drove that herd were paid $30 for 2 months of hell. Some quit halfway through. Some finished the drive and never worked cattle again. The Babbitts replaced them. Labor was expendable. Cattle were assets. The calculation was simple. The federal permits that seemed so generous in good years became a liability in bad years. If the Babbitts had owned the land, they could have controlled water sources, drilled wells, built tanks, managed the grass. But they did not own the land. They owned permission to use it. When the land stopped producing, permission was worthless. The drought of 1893 was a warning. The Babbitts learned from it, but they did not change the fundamental model. They doubled down on permits, and that bet would define the ranch for the next century. Compare this to Texas ranches like the 6-6s. Burke Burnett bought land. He paid 25 cents to $1 per acre. He owned it, he controlled it, he could sell it. The Babbitts paid pennies for permits. They controlled the grass, but not the land. They could not sell the federal acreage. They could only sell the permits, which were only valuable as long as the government allowed grazing to continue. This model worked brilliantly when the government was friendly to ranching. It would nearly destroy the Babbitts when the government changed its mind, but that was decades away. In the early 1900s, the Babbitts rode a wave of federal generosity. Cheap permits, no environmental regulations, no endangered species protections, no restrictions on stocking rates. It was a rancher's paradise. But expansion required labor, and labor on a ranch this size meant dozens of workers spread across hundreds of miles of rough country. Cowboys to tend cattle, cooks to feed crews, fence riders to maintain hundreds of miles of wire. The Babbitts needed an army, and unlike the 6-6s, which could attract workers to a central headquarters, the CO bar was diffuse. Remote line camps scattered across northern Arizona. No towns nearby, no amenities, just isolation and work. The turnover was high. Cowboys came and went. Some stayed for years, most stayed for months. The wages were standard for the era, $30 to $40 per month plus room and board. The work was hard, the conditions were harsh, the winters were brutal. But there was always someone willing to take the job because work was scarce and options were limited. The Babbitts kept records of cattle, permits, and expenses. The names of most of the workers are harder to find. They were not family, not partners, they were labor, and labor was replaceable. But the family was growing, and that growth would create complications no one anticipated. Chapter 3. 37 children and the multiplication of claims. 5 brothers had 37 children. The math alone guaranteed conflict. David had 9 children, George had 7, Charles had 8, Edward had 6, William had 7. 37 heirs to an empire that was technically owned by 5 men in equal shares. When the first brother died, the question became immediate. What happens to his share? Does it go to his widow? His children? Do the children split it equally? And do those children have voting rights in ranch decisions? The Babbitt brothers, to their credit, saw the problem coming. In the 1920s, they established a family council structure. All major decisions about the ranch would require approval from the council. The council would include representatives from each of the 5 original brothers' lines. The idea was to preserve family control while preventing any one branch from dominating. It was a reasonable idea. It was also a guarantee of dysfunction. The structure meant that as the family grew, as 37 children became dozens of grandchildren, every branch had veto power. Want to sell land? Everyone has to agree. Want to take on debt? Everyone has to agree. Want to change grazing strategies or diversify into other businesses or sell the whole operation? Everyone has to agree. Agreement was rare. Some branches lived in Arizona and worked the ranch. They wanted to preserve the operation. Some branches left Arizona and pursued other careers. They wanted liquidity. They wanted cash out their inheritance and invest elsewhere. The working branches saw the ranch as a legacy. The distant branches saw it as an asset. The tensions were manageable when the ranch was profitable. Cattle prices were good through the 1920s and 30s. The permits remained cheap. The federal government was accommodating. The ranch generated enough income to keep everyone reasonably satisfied. But profitability depended on forces the Babbitts could not control. Cattle prices fluctuated. Droughts reduced grass. And the federal government was beginning to reconsider its generous grazing policies. In 1934, Congress passed the Taylor Grazing Act. The law created the Division of Grazing, later renamed the Bureau of Land Management, to regulate grazing on federal lands. Permits would now be issued based on carrying capacity. The number of cattle a rancher could graze would be determined by the land's ability to support them, not by the rancher's desires. For the Babbitts, this was a crisis. Their permits had allowed them to graze far more cattle than the land could sustainably support. The new regulations would force them to reduce their herd. Reduce the herd, and revenue drops. Drop revenue, and the distant family branches would demand change. The family council fought over the response. Some wanted to comply immediately. Some wanted to fight the regulations. Some wanted to sell before the permits lost value. No consensus was reached. The ranch continued operating under the old stocking rates, hoping the government would not enforce the new rules aggressively. The government did not enforce aggressively at first. World War II created demand for beef. The federal government needed ranchers to produce. Enforcement was LAX. The Babbitts survived the 1940s without major reductions. But the war also produced something else. A Babbitt who would go into politics. A great-nephew of the founders named Bruce Babbitt. Born in 1938 to a family that was already divided over the ranch's future, he would grow up to regulate his own family. And the conflict that created would expose just how fragile the Babbitt empire really was. Chapter 4. When your family member becomes your regulator. What happens when your family member regulates you? Bruce Babbitt found out. Bruce was not part of the ranching branch. His father had left Arizona to pursue other interests. Bruce grew up in Los Angeles, attended Notre Dame, then Harvard Law School. He came back to Arizona to practice law, not to run cattle. But the ranch was always there. He was a Babbitt. He owned shares. He had a seat on the family council. He had opinions about what the ranch should do. In 1978, at age 40, Bruce Babbitt was elected governor of Arizona, a Democrat in a Republican-leaning state, an environmentalist in a state dominated by extractive industries, a member of a ranching family who believed that ranchers were overgrazing public lands. The contradictions were obvious. As governor, Babbitt pushed for stronger environmental protections. He supported limits on grazing. He advocated for wilderness designations that would close some federal lands to cattle. And every policy he supported threatened his own family's business model. The ranching branches of the Babbitt family were furious. They saw Bruce as a traitor. He was using his political platform to undermine the permits that the family depended on. He was siding with environmentalists against his own relatives. Family council meetings became bitter. Bruce argued that the ranch needed to adapt. The era of unlimited grazing was over. The family needed to reduce stocking rates, diversify, modernize. The ranching branches argued that Bruce was destroying the legacy the founders had built. Bruce served 2 terms as governor, leaving office in 1987. He ran for president in 1988. He lost. Then, in 1993, President Bill Clinton appointed him Secretary of the Interior. The Interior Department oversees the Bureau of Land Management. The BLM issues grazing permits. Bruce Babbitt, member of a family that held grazing permits for 750,000 acres of federal land, was now in charge of the agency that regulated those permits. The conflict of interest was staggering. Babbitt recused himself from decisions that directly affected his family's permits. But he set the policy. He appointed the officials who made the decisions. He shaped the regulations that the BLM enforced, and those regulations, under his leadership, became much more restrictive. The BLM reduced permitted stocking rates across the West. They enforced seasonal limits. They designated critical habitat for endangered species and closed those areas to grazing. They increased permit fees. They required environmental assessments before renewing permits. All of this hurt ranchers, and it hurt the Babbitt Ranch. By the late 1990s, the Babbitt family's permitted cattle numbers had been reduced by nearly 20%. Revenue dropped accordingly. The distant family branches demanded action. Sell the ranch. Sell the permits. Get out while the permits still had value. The working branches refused. This is a legacy. We are not giving up. Bruce Babbitt left Interior in 2001. By then, the damage to family relationships was severe. Some branches would not speak to him. Others supported his environmental stance, but agreed that his role had created an impossible conflict. The ranch survived, but the unity the founders had tried to preserve was gone. Thanksgiving, 1998. The family gathered at the old ranch house in Flagstaff. 43 Babbitts under one roof, 3 generations. The working branches had insisted on the gathering. We need to talk, face to face, no lawyers, no mediators, just family. Bruce Babbitt was there, still serving as Interior Secretary, still regulating the permits his family depended on. The tension started before dinner. One of the ranching cousins, a man named Paul, who managed day-to-day operations, cornered Bruce in the kitchen. "You are destroying us? You know that, right?" Bruce said something about sustainable grazing, about the science showing the land was overgrazed, about his obligation to manage public resources for all Americans, not just his family. Paul said something about betrayal, about priorities, about blood being thicker than bureaucracy. The argument moved to the dining room. Other family members joined. The distant branches, the ones who wanted to sell, stayed quiet at first. They saw the fight coming and did not want to be in the middle. But the working branches were furious. They had numbers. Stocking rates had been cut 18% since Bruce took office. Revenue was down. Profits were down. And Bruce was the reason. One of the older family members, a woman named Margaret, who had worked the ranch in the 1960s, stood up. She said Bruce had forgotten where he came from, that the founders built the ranch for their descendants, that Bruce was using his government position to punish his own family for political gain, that he should be ashamed. Bruce responded. He said the founders had built the ranch on a subsidy, that federal grazing fees were below market rate, that the family had profited for decades by grazing public land at taxpayer expense, that the bill was coming due and it was fair. The room erupted, shouting, accusations. Paul threw a glass. It hit the wall and shattered. Margaret walked out. Several working branch members followed her. Bruce sat there. His wife tried to calm things. It did not work. The distant branches saw an opportunity. If the working branches and Bruce were at war, maybe this was the time to push for a sale. One of them, a lawyer from Boston, suggested it. "We should sell. The permits are declining. The family is divided. We should take an offer while we can still get one." The working branches turned on him. "Now you want to sell? Now, when we are under attack?" "You are as bad as Bruce. Worse. At least Bruce believes in something. You just want money." The dinner never happened. People left. Some went to hotels. Some drove back to Phoenix or Tucson or wherever they lived. The ones who stayed did not speak. By midnight, the house was empty except for the hosts who sat in the kitchen surrounded by uneaten food. Bruce and his wife left early the next morning. He did not attend another family gathering for 5 years. When he finally did, in 2003, after leaving Interior, people were civil. But the warmth was gone. The trust was gone. The idea that family came first was gone. Paul Babbitt retired in 2005. In an interview years later, he said the ranch survived the permit reductions, but it never recovered from that Thanksgiving. The split was permanent. The working branches stopped trusting the distant branches. The distant branches stopped caring about the legacy. And everyone stopped trusting Bruce. The family that the founders had tried to hold together through governance structures fractured in a single night over a broken glass and words that could not be taken back. And the environmental battles were only beginning. Chapter 5. The war over grass and owls and species no one had heard of. The spotted owl was not the problem in Arizona, but it became the symbol. In the 1990s, environmental groups used the Endangered Species Act as a weapon against ranching, not because they hated cows, because the law gave them leverage. The Mexican spotted owl was listed as threatened in 1993. Its habitat included the mixed conifer forests of northern Arizona, forests where the Babbitt Ranch grazed cattle in summer. The listing required the BLM to assess whether grazing harmed owl habitat. If it did, grazing had to be reduced or eliminated. Environmental groups sued. They argued that cattle trampled vegetation, degraded streams, and reduced the insect populations that owls depended on. The science was disputed, but the law was clear. If there was evidence of harm, the government had to act. The Babbitt Ranch hired biologists. They produced studies showing minimal impact. The environmental groups produced counter-studies. The litigation dragged on for years. Meanwhile, the BLM reduced permitted cattle numbers as a precaution. Revenue dropped again. The spotted owl was not the only issue. The southwestern willow flycatcher, the spike-dace minnow, the loach minnow, the razorback sucker, species that most Arizonans had never heard of, became central to legal battles over grazing permits. Each listing triggered reviews. Each review resulted in restrictions. The Babbitts were not alone. Ranchers across the West faced similar challenges, but the Babbitts were uniquely vulnerable. They did not own the land, they owned permits. Permits could be reduced or revoked. A Texas rancher who owned his land could fight in court and keep grazing while the lawsuit proceeded. The Babbitts could not. Their permits were subject to administrative decisions. The BLM could reduce stocking rates immediately. The Babbitts could appeal, but the reduction was enforced while the appeal was pending. By 2005, the Babbitt Ranch was grazing fewer cattle than at any time since the 1930s. The margins were thin. The family council was deadlocked. Some branches wanted to sue the government. Some wanted to negotiate. Some wanted to sell before the permits became worthless. No decision was made. The paralysis continued, and then the offers started coming. Chapter 6. $100 million and 50 Reasons to Say No. The offer was $100 million. Cash. For the ranch, the permits, the cattle, the brand, everything. The year was 2008. The buyer was a private equity group that saw value in consolidating Western ranches. They wanted the Babbitt operation as part of a portfolio. The family council met to discuss the offer. Half the room wanted to sell. The permits were declining in value. The regulatory environment was hostile. Cattle prices were volatile. $100 million was more money than the ranch would generate in profit over the next 50 years. Take the deal. Distribute the cash. Move on. The other half refused. This is not just a business. This is a legacy. The founders built this. We have a responsibility to preserve it. Selling means the end of the Babbitt name in Arizona ranching. We cannot do that. The vote was called. The family governance structure required unanimous consent for a sale. The vote was not unanimous. The offer was rejected. The private equity group raised the offer. $110 million, then $120 million. Each time, the vote was the same. Close, but not unanimous. The paralysis held. Over the next 15 years, at least 5 more serious offers would come. Some from conservation groups who wanted to retire the grazing permits and restore the land. Some from wealthy individuals who wanted a Western ranch. Some from corporations looking for agricultural assets. The offers ranged from $80 million to over $150 million. Every offer was rejected. Not because the family did not want to sell, because half wanted to sell and half did not, and the structure required everyone to agree. 2014, the offer was $137 million. The buyer was a consortium of wealthy families from California and Texas who wanted a working ranch. They were not developers. They were not investors planning to flip the asset. They wanted what the Babbitts had, a million-acre operation, a legacy brand, a piece of the American West that still functioned the way it had a century ago. The offer included conditions. The Babbitt name would stay on the brand for at least 20 years. The current ranch manager would be retained. The cowboys who wanted to stay would keep their jobs. The buyers would honor the respectful traditions. This was not a hostile takeover. This was a respectful acquisition by people who understood ranching. The family council met in Phoenix, a conference room at a law office. 51 Babbitt descendants were represented, some in person, some by phone, some by proxy. The meeting lasted 9 hours. The working branches presented their case. This ranch has been in our family for 128 years, 5 generations. Our great-great-grandfathers built this. We cannot sell it to strangers. The money does not matter. The legacy matters. If we sell, we are admitting that everything the founders built can be reduced to a dollar amount. We are better than that. The distant branches presented their case. $137 million, divided among 51 shareholders. That is roughly $2.7 million per person. Some of us need that money. Some of us have children to educate, medical bills to pay, lives to build. This ranch is an asset. Assets should generate returns or be liquidated. We have been holding an illiquid investment for decades. This is our chance to finally access the value of our inheritance. We should take it. The debate went back and forth. The working branches argued that selling would destroy jobs, that the buyers might honor their commitments for a few years but eventually would change management, that once the Babbitt family lost control, the ranch would become just another corporate operation, that the workers who had been with the ranch for generations would be fired and replaced with cheaper labor, that the traditions would die. The distant branches argued that the working branches were being sentimental, that the ranch was already a business, not a family farm, that it employed over 100 people, most of whom were not family, that it operated like a corporation, that pretending otherwise was dishonest, that the only difference between the current structure and selling to the buyers was who received the profits. A vote was called. The family governance required 80% approval for a sale. 41 votes out of 51. The count was close. 38 voted yes. 13 voted no. The motion failed. The working branches celebrated. We held the line. We preserved the legacy. The distant branches were furious. 13 people just blocked 38 people from accessing their own inheritance. This is tyranny, not governance. One of the distant branch members, a woman named Sarah, who lived in Seattle and had visited the ranch twice in her life, stood up and spoke. She said she was done. Done with the family council, done with the meetings, done with the fiction that this was about legacy. She said the working branches had stolen her inheritance, that they were using the governance structure to enrich themselves at the expense of everyone else, that she would sue if necessary, that this was not over. She did sue. 2 other distant branch members joined her. The lawsuit claimed that the family governance structure was invalid, that it violated shareholder rights, that forcing minority shareholders to hold an illiquid asset indefinitely was a form of oppression. The case went to court. It lasted 3 years. The Babbitt family spent over $2 million on legal fees. The working branches won. The governance structure was upheld, but the victory was hollow. The buyers withdrew their offer in 2015. They had waited long enough. They bought a different ranch in Montana. The Babbitts were left with an asset worth $137 million that they could not sell, and a family that had spent $2 million fighting each other in court. Sarah Babbitt did not attend another family council meeting. Neither did the other 2 plaintiffs. They sent proxies. They voted no on everything, not because they opposed the proposals, but because they wanted to punish the working branches for blocking the sale. The dysfunction became institutional, and the ranch kept operating, because the one thing everyone could agree on was that shutting down was worse than fighting. By 2020, the estimated value had risen to over $300 million. No offers came. The buyers had learned. The Babbitt family would never agree to sell. Why waste time making offers that would be rejected? The ranch became known in investment circles as the UN sellable asset. a cautionary tale, a reminder that family businesses can become a family prison, and the Babbitts were serving a life sentence. The distant branches grew bitter. They watched their inheritance appreciate on paper, but could not access the value. They proposed restructuring. Let each branch decide whether to sell their share. The working branches refused. Fragmentation would destroy the operation. If you want out, sell your shares to another family member. But we are not selling to outsiders. Some branches tried to sell internally. The prices were absurd. A share that might be worth $2 million if the whole ranch sold was offered to other family members for $500,000. No one bought. The liquidity problem persisted. Lawsuits were filed. Some branches sued to force a sale. Others sued to block restructuring. Mediators were hired. Settlements were reached. The settlements prevented liquidation but did not solve the underlying problem. The ranch could not be sold without unanimous consent. Unanimous consent was impossible. By 2020, the Babbitt Ranch was worth an estimated $300 million. It was also unsellable. 50 descendants of the original 5 brothers owned shares. Each had 1 vote. Any one of them could block a sale, and several of them did, every time. The working branches continued operating the ranch. The distant branches continued demanding liquidity. The cycle continued, and the workers who actually ran the operation watched the family fight while the cattle still needed water and the fences still needed fixing. Chapter 7. Someone has to check the cattle. Someone has to check the cattle. Someone has to fix the fences. Someone has to haul water when the tanks go dry. The Babbitt family owns the ranch, but the workers run it. The CO bar employs roughly 100 people. 20 to 30 are full-time cowboys. The rest are cooks, mechanics, managers, seasonal workers. Some are third-generation employees. Their grandfathers worked for the Babbitts. Their fathers worked for the Babbitts. They work for the Babbitts. The wages are competitive for ranch work, $40,000 to $60,000 per year for experienced hands. Housing is provided in some cases. Benefits are standard. The work is hard but steady. In rural northern Arizona, steady work is valuable. But the workers exist in a strange space. The family fights over millions of dollars. The workers earn hourly wages. The family debates whether to sell. The workers know that if the ranch sells, they might lose their jobs. But they have no vote, no say, no control. They just work. The line camps are still there. Remote cabins scattered across the grazing permits. Some have electricity, some do not. Cowboys rotate through them, spending weeks at a time checking cattle, fixing fence, monitoring water sources. The isolation is profound. Cell service is non-existent in most areas. Radio communication is limited. If something goes wrong, help is hours away. The work has not changed much in a century. Horses are still used because the terrain is too rough for vehicles in many areas. Cattle are gathered on horseback. Calves are branded the old way. The tools are better. The trucks are newer. But the fundamentals are the same. Find the cattle, check their condition, move them if necessary. Repeat. The turnover is lower than in the early days. Modern ranch workers have more options. If the Babbitt Ranch does not pay well or treat workers fairly, people leave. And finding skilled ranch labor is harder now than it was in 1900. The population of northern Arizona has grown, but the number of people who know how to work cattle has not. Jim Hosteen started at the CO bar in 1976. He was 19 years old, fresh out of high school, Navajo, grew up on the reservation east of Flagstaff. He knew horses, he knew cattle, he needed work. The Babbitts hired him. His first assignment was a line camp 40 miles from headquarters with no electricity, no running water, a one-room cabin with a wood stove and a cot, a corral for horses, and a radio that barely worked. He spent 3 months there, alone, checking cattle, fixing fence, hauling water. He saw another human being maybe once a week when the supply truck came. He thought about quitting. The isolation was crushing. The work was endless. The pay was $35 a week. But he stayed because the alternative was unemployment on the reservation, because his father had told him that a man finishes what he starts, because he was good at the work and he knew it. By 1980, he was off the line camps, working at headquarters, gathering cattle during roundups, breaking horses, earning a reputation as a hand who could handle rough stock and rough country. By 1985, he was a crew boss. By 1990, he was managing one of the divisions, overseeing a dozen cowboys, making decisions about when to move cattle, where to graze, and which pastures needed rest. He watched the family fight, heard the rumors, the lawsuits, the offers to sell, the branches that wanted out and the branches that wanted to stay. He did not have an opinion, or rather, he had an opinion, but kept it to himself because his opinion did not matter. He was not a Babbitt, he was an employee, and employees do not tell owners how to run their business. But he watched what the fighting did. Projects that should have been approved were delayed for years. A new barn that the division needed, delayed. A water system upgrade that would save money long-term, delayed. Equipment purchases, delayed. Everything required family council approval, and the family council could not agree on anything. The cowboys noticed. They saw the infrastructure deteriorating. They saw the equipment aging. They saw the ranch falling behind competitors who could make decisions quickly. Some left for better opportunities. Jim stayed because he had 40 years in, because he was close to retirement, because leaving now meant starting over somewhere else at 59 years old. So he stayed and made do with old equipment and delayed projects and a family that could not get out of its own way. He retired in 2016, 60 years old, 40 years with the CO bar. The family threw him a retirement party. They gave him a buckle, a plaque, a handshake. They thanked him for his service. They told stories about his work. They made speeches about loyalty and tradition. Jim smiled and nodded. He did not tell them what he really thought, that they had wasted years fighting over money while the ranch needed investment, that the workers had kept the operation running despite the family drama, not because of it. That loyalty is a two-way street, and the family had been loyal to the legacy, but not always to the people who maintained it. After he retired, younger cowboys asked him why he stayed so long. He told them the work was good, the country was beautiful, the cattle were honest. He did not tell them about the isolation or the delayed projects or the family fights. He just said, if you are going to work cattle, you could do worse than the CO bar. It was the truth, just not the whole truth. Jim lives in Flagstaff now. He sees former co-workers occasionally. They talk about the ranch, about how things have changed, about how things have stayed the same, about whether it will last another 40 years. Jim says it will, because the family cannot agree to sell. So it will keep going, not because anyone wants it to, but because no one can stop it. And that, he says, is the real legacy, not vision, not perseverance, just inertia. The thing in motion that stays in motion because changing direction requires agreement, and agreement is impossible. The Babbitt Ranch describes its workforce as family. The term is used carefully, not family in the ownership sense, family in the cultural sense. We take care of each other, we work together, we preserve traditions. It is a nice sentiment. But family members do not receive shares. Family members do not vote on whether to sell. Family members earn wages and hope the ranch survives long enough for them to retire. The ranch keeps records, employment records, safety records, payroll records. The names are there, but the stories are harder to find. Who were the cowboys who worked the CO bar in 1920? What were their lives like? Did they stay for years or leave after a season? Did they raise families in northern Arizona or move on? The records do not say. The ranch history focuses on the Babbitt family. The workers are background. This is not unique to the Babbitts. Every large ranch treats workers this way. Labor is essential. Labor is also expendable. When a cowboy retires or quits or gets injured, another cowboy is hired. The work continues. The story does not change. But without the workers, there is no ranch. The Babbitts own the permits. The cowboys use the permits. The cattle graze. The grass is eaten. The cycle continues. And the family keeps fighting over what to do with an empire that the workers maintain but do not own. Chapter 8. The Present. 50 descendants, 1 vote each, 0 agreement. The family council still exists. The governance structure has been modified over the decades, but the core principle remains. Major decisions require broad consensus. No single branch can force a sale. No single branch can block necessary changes. In theory, this protects the legacy. In practice, it creates paralysis. The working branches still live in Arizona. Some work the ranch directly. Some have other careers but stay involved in management. They argue that the ranch is more than a financial asset. It is a connection to place, a connection to history, a responsibility to preserve what the founders built. The distant branches live across the country. Some have never visited the ranch. Some visit occasionally. They argue that holding an illiquid asset worth hundreds of millions of dollars is irrational. The ranch generates modest returns. The permits are vulnerable to political changes. The smart move is to sell, take the cash, and invest in assets that are not dependent on federal grazing policy. Both sides have a point. The working branches are right that selling would end the Babbitt ranching legacy. The distant branches are right that the financial logic favors liquidation. The problem is that the governance structure allows neither side to win, so nothing happens. The ranch continues operating. Cattle are grazed, permits are renewed, revenues are generated. Distributions are made to family members. The distributions are modest relative to the asset value, but they are enough to keep the working branches satisfied, and not enough to satisfy the distant branches who want access to the full value of their inheritance. Periodic attempts are made to restructure. Proposals to create different classes of shares. Voting shares that stay with working family members, non-voting shares that could be sold to outsiders. Every proposal is defeated. The working branches fear losing control. The distant branches fear being locked in forever. Some family members have given up. They have accepted that their shares in the ranch are an illiquid inheritance they cannot access during their lifetime. They hope their children will eventually agree to sell. Their children are equally divided. The deadlock extends to the next generation, and the offers keep coming. Conservation groups offer to buy the permits and retire them. The land would revert to wilderness. The cattle would be gone. The Babbitt name would be gone. But the federal lands would be restored. The working branches reject these offers immediately. Environmentalists are the enemy. We do not sell to the enemy. Investors offer to buy the ranch and keep operating it. The Babbitt name would remain on the brand. The operation would continue. The family would cash out. The working branches reject these too. If we do not control it, it is not ours. We do not sell control. The only offers that get serious consideration are family buyouts. One branch offers to buy out the others, but no single branch has the capital to buy everyone else out. Banks are reluctant to lend against grazing permits. The permits are not real property. They are licenses. The value is speculative. The collateral is weak. So the stalemate continues. The ranch operates, the family fights, the workers work, the cattle graze. And the question that no one can answer is simple. How long can this last? Chapter 9. What the Permits Hide. The federal government owns the grass, the Babbitts own the cattle. But who really controls the land? The answer is more complicated than either side wants to admit. Grazing permits grant the right to graze a specific number of cattle on a specific area of federal land. But they do not grant ownership. The land remains federal property. The government can revise the terms, reduce the permitted numbers, impose seasonal restrictions, require environmental mitigation, and even revoke the permit entirely if violations occur. Ranchers treat permits as property rights. They buy and sell them. They pass them to heirs. They use them as collateral. But legally, permits are privileges, revocable licenses. The distinction matters. In states like Texas, ranchers own the land. If the government wants to restrict grazing, they have to purchase the land or prove that grazing violates existing law. The rancher has property rights. The government has limited power. In Arizona, 90% of Babbitt grazing occurs on federal land. The government does not have to buy anything. It just has to change the permit terms. The rancher can appeal, but the government holds the leverage. This vulnerability shaped the Babbitt Ranch for over a century. When the government was generous, the ranch thrived. When the government imposed restrictions, the ranch struggled. The family had no control over the fundamental resource their business depended on. They were tenants, and tenants live at the landlord's discretion. The working branches argue that the permits have been held for so long that they have become property through custom and practice. The family has invested millions in infrastructure, water systems, fencing, corrals. That investment entitles them to security of tenure. The permits should not be revoked without compensation. The environmental groups argue that the permits were always temporary. The government made a mistake allowing overgrazing for decades. Correcting that mistake does not require compensating ranchers for the loss of a privilege they should never have had. The land belongs to all Americans. The cattle should be reduced or removed to protect public resources. The courts have sided with the government. Permits are licenses. They can be modified. Ranchers are entitled to due process, but they are not entitled to compensation for reduced permit values. The Babbitt Ranch has appealed permit reductions multiple times. They have won procedural victories, but the stocking rate reductions have been upheld. The economic impact has been significant. In 1990, the Babbitt Ranch was permitted to graze 22,000 cattle. By 2010, the number was reduced to 17,000. By 2020, it was 15,000. Each reduction cut revenue by hundreds of thousands of dollars per year. The working branches blame environmentalists and political shifts. They argue that the land can support more cattle. They argue that BLM assessments are biased. They argue that they are being punished for political reasons. The distant branches blame the working branches for not adapting sooner. If the family had diversified, if they had bought more private land, if they had modernized operations to be less dependent on federal permits, then the reductions would not have hurt as much. But the governance structure prevented adaptation. The working branches resisted change, and now everyone pays the price. The permits remain the foundation of the operation. Without them, The Babbitt Ranch is a few thousand acres of private land and a brand name. With them, it is a 750,000-acre empire. But the permits are fragile. Political winds shift. Regulations change. And the family that built its fortune on government generosity learned that government generosity does not last. Chapter 10. What Remains? The ranch still operates. The cattle still graze. The Babbitt name still appears on maps and brands and political discussions. But what remains is not what the founders built. It is what survived the fighting. The working branches maintain the traditions. Horses, cowboys, line camps. The tools have improved. The trucks are newer. But the methods are old. Cattle are gathered on horseback. Calves are branded in corrals. The chuck wagon still appears during roundup. This is heritage. This is what we preserve. The distant branches see an asset that generates below-market returns. $300 million in estimated value, producing maybe $3 million per year in distributions. A 1% return. You could put that money in an index fund and earn 6% or 7% with no risk and no family drama. The argument is rational. It is also irrelevant. The structure does not allow liquidation. The environmental groups see an outdated industry clinging to subsidized grazing on public land. They argue that the era of cattle on federal land should end. The land should be restored. Wildlife should be prioritized. Ranchers should be compensated fairly and transitioned out. The working branches see this as an existential threat. If grazing ends, the ranch ends. That cannot be allowed. The workers see a job, a paycheck, a way of life that they know. The family drama does not affect them directly. The cattle still need tending. The fences still need fixing. As long as the ranch operates, they have work. If it closes or sells, they look for other jobs. It is that simple, and that complicated. Bruce Babbitt is retired now. He still owns shares. He still attends family council meetings when invited. His tenure as Interior Secretary remains controversial within the family. Some blame him for the permit reductions. Some credit him for forcing the ranch to adapt. He argues that the ranch survived because it had no choice but to change. The distant branches argue that the ranch survived despite him, not because of him. The brand still has power. The CO bar is recognized across Arizona. When Babbitt cattle are sold, they command premium prices. The genetics are good. The management is respected. The legacy means something in the market. Whether it means enough to justify holding an illiquid $300 million asset is the question that divides the family. And the land keeps asking for maintenance. A spring needs cleaning. A fence needs repair. A road washes out. The work never stops. The land does not care about family disputes or permit battles or political legacies. The land just is. Grass grows, cattle eat, water flows. The cycle continues whether the family agrees on anything or not. The ranch that the 5 brothers built was supposed to be a legacy for their children. It became a trap, a structure that prevented any branch from dominating, but also prevented anyone from acting. A business that survived not through decisive leadership, but through institutional inertia. An empire built on federal generosity that nearly collapsed when federal policy changed. And a family that loved the ranch enough to fight over it for 130 years, but could not love each other enough to agree on what to do with it. Chapter 11. The Mirror. The last chapter is not about the Babbitts. It is about us. We want our family businesses to last. We want our children to inherit what we built. We want legacies that outlive us. And we create governance structures to preserve those legacies. structures that require agreement, structures that prevent any one heir from making unilateral decisions, structures that protect the business from being sold by a single reckless descendant. And those structures work until they do not, until the family grows too large, until interests diverge too widely, until half wants to keep and half wants to sell. And then the structure that was designed to preserve the legacy becomes the structure that prevents anyone from making any decision at all. The Babbitt Ranch is not a failure. It still operates. It still employs people. It still produces beef. It has survived for 138 years. Most businesses do not last that long. Most family businesses fragment within 2 generations. The Babbitts held together for 5 generations. That is remarkable. But it is also a warning. Holding together does not mean thriving. It means not collapsing. The Babbitt Ranch did not expand in decades. It did not diversify significantly. It did not adapt as quickly as competitors, because adaptation required agreement, and agreement was impossible. The 5 brothers built the ranch on federal land they did not own. They secured permits that were cheap and abundant. They hired workers at low wages. They expanded aggressively. They made money. And they created a governance structure that ensured their children would share control. The children inherited the structure. The grandchildren inherited the structure. The great-grandchildren inherited the structure. And each generation discovered that sharing control means no one has control. That unanimous consent means paralysis. That preserving the legacy means sacrificing the ability to change. Bruce Babbitt tried to change from the outside. He used his political power to force ranchers, including his own family, to reduce overgrazing. He believed the environmental regulations were necessary. He believed the ranch would survive by adapting. He may have been right, but the cost was family unity, and family unity was supposed to be the point of the structure. The workers built the ranch in the physical sense. They dug the ditches, they strung the fence, they gathered the cattle, they maintained the infrastructure, and they were never given shares, never given votes, never given a say in whether the ranch should be sold or kept or restructured. They just worked, and when the family fought, the workers kept working, because that is what workers do. The distant branches are not wrong to want liquidity. An illiquid asset that generates low returns and cannot be sold is a bad investment. The working branches are not wrong to want to preserve the legacy. A ranch that has operated for over a century and still bears the family name is worth something beyond dollars. Both are right, and both are trapped. Trapped by a structure that was designed to prevent exactly this kind of conflict, but instead guarantees it. So, what is the Babbitt Ranch? A monument to family perseverance? Or a cautionary tale about governance structures that prevent anyone from ever making a decision? A legacy preserved? Or a business paralyzed? The answer is both. It has always been both. The ranch survives because the structure prevents anyone from killing it. The ranch cannot thrive because the structure prevents anyone from changing it, and the longer it continues, the harder it becomes to resolve. 50 descendants, 1 vote each, 0 agreement. That is the Babbitt Ranch. That is the legacy the 5 brothers left. Not just land and cattle and permits, but a system that ensures their descendants will fight over it forever. And maybe that is the real legacy, not what they built, but what they could not let go. The next time you hear about a family ranch or a family business that has lasted for generations, ask yourself what the cost was. Ask yourself whether survival means success. Ask yourself whether the family that owns it is happy or just stuck. Ask yourself what they gave up to keep the name on the gate. Because empires are not built on vision alone. They are built on cheap land and cheap labor and structures that concentrate power and keep it concentrated. And when those structures work, the family gets rich. And when those structures fail, the family gets trapped. And the Babbitts have been trapped for a very long time. If you found this investigation into family dysfunction and ranch economics valuable, please like and subscribe for more deep dives into the businesses that shaped the West and the families that could not agree on what to do with them. Thank you for watching.